Hello, second graders. Hope you just had lunch. It is now time for our read aloud. And for the first time, okay, exclusive premiere right here, you're going to see Abraham Lincoln wearing rollerblades, hitting a hockey puck, trying to hit the red bag. Okay, so I got the blades on. Okay, Abraham Lincoln, here we go. Let's lift that up just a little bit. Okay, here we go. You see the red bag in the picture, right? Okay. You can't see my face, but you can see Abe Lincoln. Here we go. Shot. Oh, close. Close. Another one. Oh, I hit it. Did you see that? I hit it. Abraham Lincoln hits the red bag. Okay. He's just scraped the side of the bag, just like that bullet that kind of hit the sleeve of Clara Barton, right? I hit the bag. Abraham Lincoln hits the bag. You saw it here first, ladies and gentlemen. You saw it first. Abraham Lincoln in skates with a puck and a stick hits a bag about this big. Unbelievable. All right, so we're going to start our read aloud. We've been reading about the Civil War. Yesterday we read about Ulysses S. Grant, who, you guys remember what his nickname was? Unconditional surrender, right? Abraham Lincoln asked him to be the general of the North because he doesn't give up. So that's a good quality that we could all learn from. So some words that we're going to come across today in our reading are on the board. The first one is equality, something we embrace here in the United States. Equality, the state of being the same. Fairness, equal, right? Equality, equal, being the same, right? It's good to practice equality in the classroom, to treat, if something does something that's not conducive to good behavior, which means if they misbehave, that they all students get the same treatment, okay? That it's equal and it's fair. How many times have I heard, that's not fair? Okay, equality. We want equality in the United States. The next word, if you can read it, I think we've seen this word before actually in one of our other readings. Maybe when we were reading about Greek mythology and the Greeks, that sort of thing. The word is prosperity. Prosperity. And that means good fortune, okay? Or financial success, which means you have enough money to buy the things you need. Okay, you might live in a nice home. And if everybody is experiencing prosperity, then everybody's doing well and happy and they're taken care of. So that's prosperity. The next word. This is kind of a compound word. Okay, we know the word sack, right? A bag. Ransacked, right? If you ransack something, you search through something to steal it, okay? Search through something to steal goods, looted, example. A burglar may have gone through a house and ransacked through everybody's stuff to find goods. So that would be ransacked. Rival. A rival is a person who's competing for the same thing, but maybe on another team. Somebody you compete against is your rival, okay? Any Denver Broncos fans? Who's a rival for the Broncos? Who do the Broncos love to beat? It kind of depends. They love to beat Seattle and they love to beat Kansas City. So they're kind of rivals. Any Green Bay Packers fans? Green Bay Packers love to beat Minnesota and they love to beat the Chicago Bears. Okay, those are rivals. Okay, the next word. United. United. There's an airline called United Airlines, but united means kind of joined together, right? Although, I'm trying to give you an example, the two soccer teams were rivals and they competed in a game At the end, they all shook hands and we're all good friends. They united as friends. Okay, united means you kind of come together. So those are words we're going to run across in our reading today. All right? So I'm going to move you on over here to where we always do our reading. Oh, the last vocabulary words. Sorry, I didn't cover that one. Abraham Lincoln wearing rollerblades. Okay. I don't know if that'll ever be on a test. But Lincoln in rollerblades. All right. So we will begin our reading today like we always do. Today we are going to read about the end of the Civil War. The Civil War is coming to an end. After 4 years, the Civil War comes to an end. You know what's really cool? You just saw Abraham Lincoln wearing rollerblades with a hockey stick, showing a little bit of accuracy, hitting a puck into a target about this big. You saw it first right here on Channel 9 News. Here we go. The end of the war. In 1865, news stories did not travel as quickly as they do today with all of our news. News travels quickly, but in 1865, not so much. There were no televisions or telephones or even radios. There were newspapers, but the news stories could be about things that happened days or even weeks before. There were also telegraphs, which were short, typed messages that required special skills to read. It could take several days for news to reach soldiers who were miles away from a town or a city with a telegraph wire. It could also take days or even weeks for news to reach their families. In tiny towns all over America, parents, wives, and children of soldiers were waiting for a son, husband, or father to return home from the war. So here you have some people looking at, looks like newspapers. The end of the war. So on April 9th, 1865, it took a little while for the news to spread that in a small farmhouse in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee surrendered the remainder of his Confederate army. Within days, most other Confederate armies that had been fighting in other parts of the country surrendered as well. So even though he surrendered, it took a couple days for all the armies to surrender because, well, they didn't know. But they did finally surrender within a couple days. The rebel soldiers laid down their weapons, made oaths to give up the rebellion and never fight against the United States again, and walked home. What are oaths? Do you remember oaths? An oath is a promise, right? And what side were the rebel soldiers? On the Union, which is the North, or the Confederacy, or the South? The Confederacy, which is the South. Okay, the rebel soldiers were Confederate soldiers. The Union soldiers were relieved at last. The long Civil War was ended, and the North had won. It was time to return home, rest, and rebuild the nation. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to being united again. Okay. United means together as one. So when we talked about the Civil War, and a couple days ago, some of us may have predicted that the North would win or the South would win. Were your predictions correct? So the North, or the Union, won the Civil War. For the most part, the cities of the North had not been damaged. Why was the North hardly damaged, do you think? Probably because all the battles, most of the battles, took place in the South. With the end of the war, Northerners started to think about how to make the country bigger. They focused on building more railroads and spreading westward across the Mississippi River through Missouri and Kansas, over the Rocky Mountains, which is by us, and all the way to California. Why did people want to go west? Do you guys remember when we talked about the Oregon Trail? Why did they want to go west? Because they wanted to find new land, start farms, right? Okay. For people in the North, life would finally start getting back to normal. They were glad to have something to make their factories, making their factories other than weapons and uniforms for war. Oh my goodness, look at that. That is a town destroyed. Most battles had been fought in the South. Southerners were relieved that the war was over, even if the Confederacy had lost the war. At least there was no more fighting. Nearly all the towns and cities were now ruined and burned, smashed by cannonballs or ransacked by armies in search of food. Farmlands, roads, railroad tracks, and bridges had all been destroyed as well. Times were hardest by far in the South after the war. The U.S. government sent money and supplies as well as soldiers to keep order and start rebuilding the towns and cities. This was called Reconstruction. Reconstruction, because they were rebuilding or reconstructing the South. But it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. So it would take many years. Even though the war was over, it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. For millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, all this destruction not only meant the end of the war, it meant freedom from a life of slavery. The enslaved Africans were now free people. They could not be forced to work on plantations anymore. They could not be sent away from their families anymore. They were free from slavery and ready to start their lives over again. How do you think the slaves felt about being free? I bet they were excited. They're finally free. Remember earlier you heard it took some time for news to travel, though. Well, it took 2 months for the news that the war had ended to reach African Americans in the state of Texas. 2 months. 2 months. Something happens in the United States and it's on the news in an hour or less, sometimes 15 minutes. 2 months. Okay? We've been home from school for about a month. Okay? 2 months. The Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 9th, 1865 to announce the end of the war and the abolition of slavery. When the African American people in Galveston heard the news, they immediately began to celebrate with prayer, feasting, music, and dancing. Today, Juneteenth is a holiday tradition celebrated annually on June 19th in many states across the country. It is the oldest known celebration recognizing the end of slavery. Many African Americans freed from slavery wanted to get as far away from the South as possible. Why do you think they wanted to get away from the South? They were free, but why do you think they wanted to get away? I bet some people in the South still embrace their heritage. Remember we talked about that? And even though the South lost the war, I bet they still wanted slaves and still felt that way. Some moved north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Washington, D.C. Many arrived with no possessions and no money. Nothing but the clothing on their backs and hope for a better life. They worked in factories, built new businesses, and created new neighborhoods, schools, and communities. However, African Americans still face some of the toughest challenges of all. For although they were free, they did not have all the same rights as white Americans in the North and the South. The end of the Civil War was the beginning of a new age in America. There were still hard times ahead, as well as sadness, but the country was unified as a single nation. The Civil War produced many heroes, including one of the most famous Americans of all, Abraham Lincoln. His face appears today on the penny and the $5 bill. There are thousands of towns, buildings, roads, bridges, tunnels, such as the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and people named after him. In Washington, D.C., there is a giant monument honoring him called the Lincoln Memorial. I've been to the Lincoln Memorial. And a monument is a structure built in the memory of something. 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., remember we read about him in our Scholastic News. Okay, 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave the very famous I Have a Dream speech. 100 years after the end of slavery, Dr. King and other African Americans continued to work and struggle for fair treatment and equal rights. Throughout the Civil War, Harriet Tubman continued risking her life to free enslaved people and end slavery. During some battles, she also worked as a nurse and sometimes as a spy for the Union Army. Because Harriet Tubman knew the roads and secret trails, remember Harriet Tubman, she knew the secret trails all around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. She was able to spy in the Confederate Army, telling Union generals in which direction the army was going and how many men they had. After the war, Harriet Tubman moved to Washington, D.C., where she helped thousands of newly freed African Americans find jobs and homes and begin their new lives. She also worked for women's rights. During the time of the Civil War, women, black and white alike, were not allowed to vote. Can women vote today? Of course they can, but you will hear about women gaining the right to vote later in the Fighting for a Cause domain that we'll be reading about. That was one of the many important changes America still had to make in order for all its citizens to be truly free. Ulysses S. Grant was a hero throughout the North. He went on to become the President of the United States in 1869. His old rival, Robert E. Lee, moved back to his farm in Virginia, but was never the same again. Remember, a rival is a person you compete against. Who was Grant's rival? Robert E. Lee. He died 5 years later, sad and regretful, haunted by all the things he could or should have done during the war, but was still proud to have fought for Virginia. So we have Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. In many parts of America, people were eager to move into the future. The war had brought about a new positive change. Besides freeing the African Americans and keeping the country together, the North had developed new railroad lines to help deliver war supplies. Companies were eager to expand those railroads, especially in the West. Within a few years, there were new railroads crisscrossing the country from New York to California and back again. Telegraph wires had expanded as well. So it became possible for a person in New York and a person in California to communicate, to share news, and conduct business without waiting weeks for a letter to arrive delivered by train or on horseback. Remember we read about the Pony Express, and the telegraph kind of replaced the Pony Express. They put up those lines and they could communicate. Well, during the war and after the war, they put up more and more and more telegraph lines to communicate, and it made life better for not only people who fought in the war, but after the war, all the lines were still there. In the northern factories and schools, the Civil War had encouraged a new generation of inventors and scientists. What is an inventor? Someone who invents something, right? Now that the war was over, those inventors could think about new ways to help people instead of thinking ways to win the war. They invented new trains, new telegraphs, and new machines of all sorts. Doctors had discovered new types of medicine and new ways to treat injuries and diseases. The Civil War changed the United States in many, many ways. Hundreds of thousands of men had died. Millions were badly wounded. At the same time, the nation was once again one nation. And millions of former enslaved African Americans were now free. Many fought for this freedom, including many African Americans. Now all Americans were working toward a better, brighter future. All right, second graders. Who won the war? The Union, right? The North. The North won the war. And who was the general in the North? Not Robert E. Lee, but Ulysses S. Grant, who became president after Abraham Lincoln. Okay? So what did the end of the war mean? So the North wins the war. What happens? What happened? African Americans became free, right? How long did this war last? You guys remember? Not 2, not 3, 4 years. And who had the bigger challenge after the war, the North or the South? Who do you think? All the cities, a bunch of the major cities were destroyed and burned to the ground in the North or the South? The South. So in the South, they had to rebuild all that stuff. In the North, they're changing their factories to make new things, but in the South, they have to rebuild their cities. And after the war ended, some of these changes, what were some of the changes? Like I said, the North, the factories could build new things. What was something else we talked about, read about? The railroad, telegraphs, better communication, African Americans moving into certain cities in the North. And remember Harriet Tubman, this goes back a ways. I was gone that day, but we had a substitute teacher. And you guys learned about Harriet Tubman and how she helped African Americans escape slavery. And she had secret trails and stuff, and she helped them. After the war, she was still active. What did she do? She helped the newly freed African Americans find jobs and homes. And I already said this, but what happened to Ulysses S. Grant after the war? He became president. So no more Abraham Lincoln. Oh, look, I have tape on my face. No more Abraham Lincoln as president. It's now Ulysses S. Grant. How do you think President Lincoln felt after the war was over? Do you think he was happy? I bet he was. I bet he was proud that he's the commander-in-chief. I bet he was proud that the North won, and he had Ulysses S. Grant lead the soldiers, lead the troops, and win the battle. So that will conclude our learning of the Civil War. Tomorrow I'm going to have the thumbs up, thumbs down. I'm going to ask you questions, so you're going to need to watch the video and answer the questions as we go. So we'll do thumbs up, thumbs down. Better check the sheet. On this sheet, before you go, I would like you to send this in. I'd like you to tell me some of the things about what happened at the end of the Civil War. Okay? Give me 2 sentences or 3 sentences. Give me 3 sentences, because we talked about a lot of things. So 3 sentences about things that happened after the Civil War. Okay, as a result of the North or the Union winning, what's going on now? What's happening in the South? We talked about it. We read about it. We have a new president. Well, we read a whole bunch of things. So give me some sentences. Draw your picture here. I love your pictures, guys. Some of the pictures that have come back here are just amazing. So love to see that. And hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all healthy, washing your hands, helping mom and dad with chores, giving them lots of hugs, because they need that just as much as you do. So make sure you're telling mom and dad how lucky you are. And take care. Okay, next is handwriting.